The police showed up at my door because I refused to follow the HOA's rules. What the HOA didn't know was that I owned every single house on the street, all 60 of them, and that little detail was about to change everything. It started when I received a violation notice from the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. According to the letter, I had violated community regulations by allowing a contractor to work on one of my properties without prior HOA approval. There was just one problem. I didn't live in the neighborhood. I owned the homes as rental properties. For years, my company had purchased houses in Cedar Ridge one by one. Some were renovated, some were rented, and a few were still being upgraded. Eventually, my company owned all 60 homes inside one particular section of the development. The HOA knew my company owned several properties, but apparently nobody had ever checked the full ownership records. I ignored the first violation notice. Then came another, then a warning about landscaping, then a notice claiming that one of my contractors had violated parking rules. I responded politely each time. I asked the HOA to identify the exact rule and explain how it applied to the property. Instead of answering, the HOA president, Karen Whitmore, decided to visit me personally. She arrived at one of my rental homes with 2 board members. She told me that the HOA had authority over every property in the community. I asked her to show me the governing documents. She said, "Everyone here follows the same rules." I replied, "That's not what I asked." She wasn't happy. A few days later, I received another notice. This time, it demanded that I remove several approved-looking landscaping improvements from one of my properties. I checked the purchase documents. The improvements had already been approved by the county. They weren't dangerous. They weren't illegal. And the HOA's own documents didn't clearly prohibit them. So I refused. Karen responded by saying the HOA would take further action. I didn't think much of it until the police arrived. 2 officers pulled up outside one of my properties. Karen was standing beside them. She told the officers that I was refusing to comply with HOA regulations. One officer asked me whether I was a homeowner. I said, "Technically, I'm the owner of this property." Then he asked, "Do you live here?" "No." Karen immediately stepped forward. "See? He's violating the community rules." The officer looked confused. He asked me whether I had broken into the property or damaged anything. I said no. Then he asked whether there was an active court order against me. Again, no. The officer calmly explained that an HOA dispute was generally a civil matter. Karen wasn't satisfied. She insisted that I was refusing to obey the association. That's when I decided to stop explaining things verbally. I pulled out my phone. I opened the county property records, and I showed the officer the ownership information. He looked at the screen, then looked at me, then back at the screen. "How many properties do you own here?" I smiled. 60. Karen's expression changed instantly. The officers didn't say much. They simply told everyone that the dispute would need to be handled through the proper civil process. Then they left. Karen remained standing there. She clearly thought I was bluffing, so she called an emergency HOA board meeting. I attended. Karen began by explaining that a property owner was refusing to follow community regulations. She never mentioned that the owner controlled a huge portion of the neighborhood. I brought the records. One by one, I showed the board the deeds. Property number 1, property number 2, property number 3. By the 10th document, the room had gone quiet. By 20, people were staring at each other. By 40, nobody was interrupting. And when I placed the final records on the table, I said, "These 60 homes are owned by my company." Karen looked stunned. One board member asked, "All 60? All 60? Then someone asked a question that changed the entire meeting. If he owns all those properties, how many HOA votes does he control? That was the moment Karen realized the problem. The HOA had been treating me like a difficult homeowner. But I wasn't simply one homeowner. My company represented the ownership of every property in that section. The association's own governing documents contained voting provisions tied to property ownership. That meant the situation was much more complicated than Karen had assumed. I wasn't claiming the HOA rules didn't matter. They did. But the HOA also couldn't simply invent rules, ignore its governing documents, or use the police to settle ordinary property disputes. My attorney later reviewed the association's documents with the board. He explained that the HOA needed to follow its own procedures just as homeowners did. If a rule was valid, we would follow it. If a rule wasn't valid, the board needed to address the issue properly. That was a difference. I wasn't trying to destroy the HOA. I wanted it to operate according to the documents everyone had agreed to. The board eventually withdrew several of the questionable violations. They also agreed to review the association's enforcement procedures. Karen remained president for a short time, but the relationship with the homeowners had changed. People started asking questions. Why hadn't the board known about the ownership structure? Why had police been called over a civil disagreement? And why had the HOA been threatening enforcement before checking the actual property records? A few weeks later, I received a letter from the board. It wasn't another violation. It was an invitation to work together on updating the association's procedures. I accepted, because the truth was, I didn't want 60 homes to become a battlefield. I wanted them to be good properties with happy tenants and a properly managed community. The biggest lesson wasn't that I owned 60 homes. It was that Karen had never bothered to find out who she was dealing with. She assumed I was just another homeowner who could be pressured into compliance. She didn't check the records. She didn't understand the ownership structure. And she certainly didn't expect a person she had reported to the police to control every property in that section of the neighborhood. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can bring to an HOA dispute isn't an angry argument. It's documentation. Because when the rules are questioned, opinions don't matter nearly as much as the actual documents. And when Karen finally opened those documents, she discovered that the difficult homeowner she had been fighting with was actually the owner of all 60 homes.